The True Life Horror That Inspired Moby-Dick by Gilbert King, performed by Otis Jiry. In July of 1852, a 32-year-old novelist named Herman Melville had high hopes for his new novel, Moby-Dick, or The Whale, despite the book's mixed reviews and tepid sales. That month, he took a steamer to Nantucket for his first visit to the Massachusetts island, home port of his novel's mythic protagonist, Captain Ahab, and his ship, the Pequod. Like a tourist, Melville met with local dignitaries, dined out, and took in the sights of the village he had previously only imagined. And on his last day on Nantucket, he met the broken-down 60-year-old man who had captained the Essex, the ship that had been attacked and sunk by a sperm whale in an 1820 incident that had inspired Melville's novel. Captain George Pollard, Jr. was just 29 years old when the Essex went down, and he survived and returned to Nantucket to captain a second whaling ship, Two Brothers. But when that ship wrecked on a coral reef 2 years later, the captain was marked as unlucky at sea, a Jonah, and no owner would trust a ship to him again. Pollard lived out his remaining years on land as the village night watchman. Melville had written about Pollard briefly in Moby-Dick, and only with regard to the whale sinking his ship. During his visit, Melville later wrote, the two merely exchanged some words. But Melville knew Pollard's ordeal at sea did not end with the sinking of the Essex, and he was not about to evoke the horrific memories that the captain surely carried with him. To the islanders, he was a nobody, Melville wrote. To me, the most impressive man, though wholly unassuming, even humble, that I ever encountered. Pollard had told the full story to fellow captains over a dinner shortly after his rescue from the Essex ordeal, and to a missionary named George Benet. To Benet, the tale was like a confession. Certainly it was grim. 92 days and sleepless nights at sea in a leaking boat with no food, his surviving crew going mad beneath the unforgiving sun, eventual cannibalism, and the harrowing fate of two teenage boys, including Pollard's first cousin, Owen Coffin. But I can tell you no more. My head is on fire at the recollection, Pollard told the missionary. I hardly know what to say. The trouble for Essex began, as Melville knew, on August 14, 1819, just 2 days after it left Nantucket on a whaling voyage that was supposed to last 2.5 years. The 87-foot-long ship was hit by a squall that destroyed its topgallant sail and nearly sank it. Still, Pollard continued, making it to Cape Horn 5 weeks later. But the 20-man crew found the waters off South America nearly fished out, so they decided to sail for distant whaling grounds in the South Pacific, far from any shores. To restock, the Essex anchored at Charles Island in the Galapagos, where the crew collected 60 100-pound tortoises. As a prank, one of the crew set a fire, which, in the dry season, quickly spread. Pollard's men barely escaped, having to run through flames, and a day after they set sail, they could still see smoke from the burning island. Pollard was furious, and swore vengeance on whoever set the fire. Many years later, Charles Island was still a blackened wasteland, and the fire was believed to have caused the extinction of both the Floriana tortoise and the Floriana mockingbird. By November of 1820, after months of a prosperous voyage and 1,000 miles from nearest land, whaleboats from the Essex had harpooned whales that dragged them out toward the horizon in what the crew called Nantucket sleigh rides. Owen Chase, the 23-year-old first mate, had stayed aboard the Essex to make repairs while Pollard went whaling. It was Chase who spotted a very big whale, 85 feet in length he estimated, lying quietly in the distance, its head facing the ship. Then, after 2 or 3 spouts, the giant made straight for the Essex, coming down for us at great celerity, Chase would recall, at about 3 knots. The whale smashed head-on into the ship with such an appalling and tremendous jar as nearly threw us all on our faces. The whale passed underneath the ship and began thrashing in the water. I could distinctly see him smite his jaws together as if distracted with rage and fury, Chase recalled. Then the whale disappeared. The crew was addressing the hole in the ship and getting the pumps working when one man cried out, "Here he is! He is making for us again." Chase spotted the whale, his head half out of water, bearing down at great speed, this time at 6 knots, Chase thought. This time it hit the bow directly under the cathead and disappeared for good. The water rushed into the ship so fast, the only thing the crew could do was lower the boats and try to fill them with navigational instruments, bread, water, and supplies before the Essex turned over on its side. Pollard saw his ship in distress from a distance, then returned to see the Essex in ruin. Dumbfounded, he asked, "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" "We have been stove by a whale," his first mate answered. Another boat returned, and the men sat in silence, their captain still pale and speechless. Some, Chase observed, had no idea of the extent of their deplorable situation. The men were unwilling to leave the doomed Essex as it slowly foundered, and Pollard tried to come up with a plan. In all, there were 3 boats and 20 men. They calculated that the closest land was the Marquesas Islands and the Society Islands, and Pollard wanted to set off for them. But in one of the most ironic decisions in nautical history, Chase and the crew convinced him that those islands were peopled with cannibals, and that the crew's best chance for survival would be to sail south. The distance to land would be far greater, but they might catch the trade winds or be spotted by another whaling ship. Only Pollard seemed to understand the implications of steering clear of the islands. According to Nathaniel Philbrick, in his book In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex, although rumors of cannibalism persisted, traders had been visiting the islands without incident. Thus they left the Essex aboard their 20-foot boats. They were challenged almost from the start. Salt water saturated the bread, and the men began to dehydrate as they ate their daily rations. The sun was ravaging. Pollard's boat was attacked by a killer whale. They spotted land, Henderson Island, 2 weeks later, but it was barren. After another week, the men began to run out of supplies. Still, 3 of them decided they'd rather take their chances on land than climb back into a boat. No one could blame them, and besides, it would stretch the provisions for the men in the boats. By mid-December, after weeks at sea, the boats began to take on water. More whales menaced the men at night, and by January the paltry rations began to take their toll. On Chase's boat, one man went mad, stood up and demanded a dinner napkin and water, then fell into most horrid and frightful convulsions, before perishing the next morning. Humanity must shudder at the dreadful recital of what came next, Chase wrote. The crew separated limbs from his body and cut all the flesh from the bones, after which we opened the body, took out the heart, and then closed it again, sewed it up as decently as we could, and committed it to the sea. They then roasted the man's organs on a flat stone and ate them. Over the coming week, 3 more sailors died and their bodies were cooked and eaten. 1 boat disappeared, and then Chase's and Pollard's boat lost sight of each other. The rations of human flesh did not last long, and the more the survivors ate, the hungrier they felt. On both boats, the men became too weak to talk. The 4 men on Pollard's boat reasoned that without more food they would die. On February 6, 1821, 9 weeks after they'd bidden farewell to the Essex, Charles Ramsdale, a teenager, proposed they draw lots to determine who would be eaten next. It was the custom of the sea, dating back, at least in recorded instance, to the first half of the 17th century. The men in Pollard's boat accepted Ramsdale's suggestion, and the lot fell to young Owen Coffin, the captain's first cousin. Pollard had promised the boy's mother he'd look out for them. My lad, the captain now shouted. If you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man that touches you. Pollard even offered to step in for the boy, but Coffin would have none of it. I like it as well as any other, he said. Ramsdale drew the lot that required him to shoot his friend. He paused a long time, but then Coffin rested his head on the boat's gunwale, and Ramsdale pulled the trigger. He was soon dispatched, Pollard would say, and nothing of him left. By February 18th, after 89 days at sea, the last three men on Chase's boat spotted a sail in the distance. After a frantic chase, they managed to catch the English ship Indian and were rescued. 300 miles away, Pollard's boat carried only its captain and Charles Ramsdale. They had only the bones of the last crewman to perish, which they smashed on the bottom of the boat so that they could eat the marrow. As the days passed, the two men obsessed over the bones scattered on the boat's floor. Almost a week after Chase and his men had been rescued, a crewman aboard the American ship Dauphin spotted Pollard's boat. Wretched and confused, Pollard and Ramsdale did not rejoice at their rescue, but simply turned to the bottom of their boat and stuffed bones into their pockets. Safely aboard the Dauphin, the two delirious men were seen sucking the bones of their dead messmates, which they were loath to part with. The 5 Essex survivors were reunited in Valparaiso, where they recuperated before sailing back to Nantucket. As Philbrick writes, Pollard had recovered enough to join several captains for dinner, and he told them the entire story of the Essex wreck and his 3 harrowing months at sea. One of the captains present returned to his room and wrote everything down, calling Pollard's account the most distressing narrative that had ever come to my knowledge. Years later, the third boat was discovered on Ducie Island. 3 skeletons were aboard. Miraculously, the 3 men who chose to stay on Henderson Island survived for nearly 4 months, mostly on shellfish and bird eggs, until an Australian ship rescued them. Once they arrived in Nantucket, the surviving crewmen of the Essex were welcomed, largely without judgment. Cannibalism, in the most dire of circumstances, it was reasoned, was a custom of the sea. In similar incidents, survivors declined to eat the flesh of the dead, but used it as bait for fish. But Philbrick notes that the men of the Essex were in waters largely devoid of marine life at the surface. Captain Pollard, however, was not as easily forgiven, because he had eaten his cousin. One scholar later referred to the act as gastronomic incest. Owen Coffin's mother could not abide being in the captain's presence. Once his days at sea were over, Pollard spent the rest of his life in Nantucket. Once a year, on the anniversary of the wreck of the Essex, he was said to have locked himself in his room and fasted in honor of the lost crewmen. By 1852, Melville and Moby-Dick had begun their own slide into obscurity. Despite the author's hopes, his book sold but a few thousand copies in his lifetime, and Melville, after a few more failed attempts at novels, settled into a reclusive life and spent 19 years as a customs inspector in New York City. He drank and suffered the death of his 2 sons. Depressed, he abandoned novels for poetry, but George Pollard's fate was never far from his mind. In his poem Clarelle, he writes, "A night patrolman on the quay, watching the bales till morning hour. Through fair and foul, never he smiled, column, and who had come not sour. In spirit, but meek and reconciled, patient he was, he none withstood, oft on some secret thing would brood." Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this story in its entirety. If you enjoy what you hear and what I do and would like to support me and my efforts, visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/Otis Jiry. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button and subscribe today, and share this video with everyone on your social media. It helps more than you could ever imagine. If you'd like to see a particular story narrated, including one you may have written yourself, send it to submissions@otisjiry.com and I'll take a look. If you're interested in more of my work in the horror genre, you can also find me at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on their website and YouTube channel, and on Chilling Tales, the podcast now available on iTunes. Again, thank you for listening and have a great day. God bless you.